Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 10th of June. Today we're looking at developments on the Velika Novosilka sector. We'll also look at some important changes on the Vavcha riverfront, some fierce battles that are ongoing within the Kanal district of Chasiv, and we'll finish off by seeing a development that occurred on the Sumy-Kursk border, specifically in the village of Rzhivka. Let's begin by looking at Staromayorsk and Oruzhenie, where the Russian MOD today claimed that they secured full control over the village of Staromayorsk. And at the same time, we got footage that backs up and advanced northwards, which shows Russians raising two flags in the northern house located at this particular geolocation. We also received an update from Deep State about an hour ago indicating that some of these fields east of Staromayorsk that are basically adjacent to the Mokryali River and some of the houses that are also located in the eastern portion of the village are under Russian control at the moment. What this means is that, first of all of the outskirts of Staromayorsk are being cleared at the moment, if they have not been cleared already. And so the Ukrainian forces are no longer present within the village. They're no longer present within the warehouses north of the village, and likely their infantry squads in the region withdrew to the warehouses over here, to the trench line built over here, with the hope of preventing the Russians from advancing along this particular paved road near the river towards the village of Makarivka to the north. And so if we look at the area to the east, this is important for the Russians because now they have a direct route to flank the Ukrainian defensive positions that were set up in the southern portion of Oruzhenie. And so we look at it, even though there aren't any physical crossings to get past the Mokryali River, it is not a particularly deep river in certain portions, and it's not really that wide, and so crossing over it is not something that is extremely difficult. And so now the Russian forces do have a new attack vector from the west, not to mention the fact that they are increasing pressure directly from the south. If we look at the elevation, I'm not going to get into it in much detail. It's just a fact of the matter is that the Russian forces have control of hills that you can't even see on the map, but they are within this red rectangle, and then you see some of it also located within this red rectangle to the east. These are generally the heights in the region that are overlooking Oruzhenie, and the Russian forces do have control over a large chunk of them on either side, and so, of course, you do have the Russian forces, at least their forward positions, stationed on vantage points and very good firing positions towards the various houses where you have Ukrainian defenders right now. And to be fair to the Ukrainians, some of these hills extend northwards over here as well. And that's mainly because, in relative terms, the various hills and fields that are located on either side of the river are, of course, going to be on higher elevation than the river valley itself. And so you see how, for instance, that puts the Ukrainians that are currently defending in Oruzhenie in a compromising situation, with the Russians trying to gain control of those flanks and at the same time advancing directly through the village. And so here we have a geolocation, came out today. It shows 4 Russian infantrymen that stormed the Ukrainian trench that was essentially built between backyards, because that's the state of this village, where you have entire houses that are either leveled or just filled with rubble, and then the backyards have been turned into these makeshift dugouts or trenches. And so the Russian infantrymen, they stormed one of them, and they were engaged in the video in firefights with Ukrainian forces that are located in various shacks and basements within the residential areas as well. And you could see just from the drone zooming out that there was significant smoke rising due to artillery shelling of the southern portion of the village. And so you do have a slight Russian advance. If we look at the extent of the gain, it amounts to around 200 meters northwards, but it is important in the sense that now the Russians have a foothold within the residential portion of the village. We also have footage released by the Ukrainian side. It's dated to June 10th, but the actual incident may have been older. What we see here is just the aftermath of a certain Russian assault, or at least Russian transportation of infantry from open fields into Staromayorsk. And what we do see is that the Ukrainian defensive capabilities were present in the region, likely a combination of artillery and drones, and they were able to destroy a Russian BMP-1, a different unnamed BMP, an armored fighting vehicle, and a T-62M. And so, yeah, basically, for a very long time now, you had certain columns of vehicles, or sometimes lone vehicles, advancing along either this paved road or on the path just to the west along this tree line. And then from there, they reach the residential areas, and then they dismount troops that secure the village itself. And then you had transition towards the Russians beginning to use motorcycles or ATVs to actually go from position to position near the line of contact in an area where the Russians would not want to expose a larger vehicle, or they wouldn't want to concentrate a large amount of infantrymen in the same area, and they would want enhanced mobility. And so we're not just seeing that in the Velika Novosilka sector, that's going on in a lot of villages where there's heavy combat. Now moving on to the area south of Novomykhailivka, or Konstantinivka, you could say. It's a very important area, as I've described numerous times, because first of all, trying to reach the road that connects Konstantinivka to Vuhledar is critical, including the defenses there. It's also important because securing the southern flank of Konstantinivka would give the Russians the hills overlooking the villages that you see marked in these two green parallel lines. And again, the culmination of that would be to reach Uspenivska, which is a very important local supply hub, and you could see how a lot of roads intersect in that region. So the Ukrainians are, of course, aware of the Russian advances in the region. We have three main areas where they advance. First of all, south of Paraskovivka. Of course, through Paraskovivka itself, but I'm not really talking about that. On the other hand, I'm referring to an advance that occurred along this paved road from Solotke, which reaches directly to the highway that is connecting Konstantinivka to Vuhledar. And then another advance that is occurring even further south, just to the north of Volodymyrivka. And so the Ukrainians, aware of the situation, they did send in some reinforcements, specifically from the Skala Assault Battalion, which it's been present in various fronts. It was present, for instance, around Krasnohorivka recently, and so now it's just conducting a lot of independent combat operations in southern Donetsk. And so they were sent in to fill gaps south of this chain of towns over here, essentially just to fill up a gap that was present and was a big issue for the Ukrainian side. And so they've just been sent in and conducted a localized counterattack. Here we see the footage of the event, which was released today, which shows an M2 Bradley counterattacking, reaching the actual tree line that the Russians took over on June 8th, I believe. And so you could see the location where the Ukrainians were able to dismount their forces within that tree line, take 8 Russian soldiers prisoner, and then dismount, of course, some of their own infantry to try to take over the rest of the fortifications in the region. And so you do see the Ukrainians trying to send in whatever forces they have in the region, rotating them even from other fronts in order to prevent any sort of Russian exploitation in this region. Now, shifting further north to Krasnohorivka, this is an area where there haven't been many developments in recent weeks, simply because the line stabilized following a sustained period of heavy fighting for the industrial district in several key apartment complexes and residential houses in the eastern section of the village, or the town, you could say. And so there was really heavy fighting over that, and since that time period, there's been a bit of an operational pause by the Russian side. The Russian garrison attacking Krasnohorivka is simply not that large from what I'm seeing. In terms of the units involved, there is some support from the 1st Army Corps, especially from this motor rifle brigade, and I'm not really seeing signs that any other ground forces are involved. There is, of course, artillery support from the 238th Brigade, and then you look at the Ukrainian side, they did move in reinforcements, whether it be from the 79th Air Assault or 80th Air Assault, or any other elements that are on the southern Donetsk front that you see operating further south around Marinka or Novomykhailivka. Chances are they may have a certain element detachment that was sent in to stabilize the line around Krasnohorivka as well before being rotated elsewhere. And so that all played a role in just decreasing the pace of the advances, especially now that you have Ukrainians trying to hold the line in this new gray zone region along these final apartments before reaching the private residential areas in the northwestern portion of the village. If we look, though, there was a minor Russian advance on June 9th. So here we have a video which shows the Ukrainians dropping grenades onto Russian positions on Sumska Street. Yeah. And that is in central Krasnohorivka. If you look at the extent of the advance, it is roughly 100 meters north. And so, again, this is a really gradual advance. Russian forces just trying to gradually expand their buffer zone north of the industrial area. And then here we see the 55th, 59th, and 79th Brigades working in tandem to strike 5 Russian vehicles that were entering into Krasnohorivka. again, with the intention of reaching a certain deployment point and then dismounting the infantry, and then from there they operate in small squads trying to push from house to house and continue advancing. What's interesting here is seeing the 55th Brigade, which is a unit that was previously operating around the Velika Novosilica sector, but again, it is an artillery unit, and so they could definitely have various batteries stationed in different areas. I'd assume that it's probably stationed around Kurakova, Selidova now, some of its batteries, if they're operating in the Krasnohorivka region as well. And so it seems like they were moved in as additional artillery support for the Ukrainian side. 79th Brigade, we know that they have been operating in Novomikhailivka for a very long time. Since the capture of the village, they've also been involved in defending Parskovievka, and now they'll also, of course, be involved in Konstantinivka. But it seems like some of their battalions have been moved elsewhere to assist with other fighting. For instance, in Marinka, they no longer have responsibilities, but around Krasnohorivka, some of their battalions or some of their companies may be present. And then, of course, I said 59th Brigade. 59th Brigade, if we're looking northwards, it's a Ukrainian unit that is involved in defending in the southern parts of the Vavcha River fronts. And so they also have a very key role in trying to hold back Russian assaults that got control over Natalove and are now assaulting Nevelske or Yaznobrodivka. Now we move to the Vavcha River front, where, as I said before, there are some important changes that were noted on June 9th and then June 10th as well. And this is backed up by geolocation and by Deep State's own reporting. And so here I have a video. It's a part of a compilation from June 9th where the Ukrainians, they dropped grenades onto newly taken Russian positions in various tree lines north of Umanske. What happened was the Russian infantry squads, they used Umanske as a linchpin, a springboard to then advance northwards, and this was done over areas that include this particular, I'd say this is just this tree line over here that extends to the northeast, and so the front line sort of stabilized along that line, and I had reported this previously based on Deep State's own mapping, but now the extent of the Russian advances has been extended further to the northwest based on the new video released by the Ukrainian side, where they're also in control of these regions. And on June 10th, Deep State admitted that this region where I have the X marked is also under Russian control. An area that I had previously marked as a gray zone, I believe this portion over here is now also under Russian control based on a geolocated, a certain snippet of the video that I have marked over here in blue that is also has also been geolocated to the position basically over here, which again confirms that you have Russian forces advancing along a broader front just north of Umanske through these fields. If you look at the elevation of these fields, some of them that are just immediately north of Umanske. Umanske, of course, it's located on a tributary of the Vavcha River. They are on a floodplain, but then you look at some of these hills that are located, for instance, I'll show them over here. These are hills that are on elevation that is, of course, overlooking the tributary of the Vavcha River, where the Ukrainians are currently trying to stabilize the front line. And what do I mean by that? I mean the basically extension of the Vavcha River, which you see in blue over here, which includes Novoselivka, Persha, and then also Novopokrovske. And so the Russian forces are, first of all, clearing the gray zone, which is supposed to be used as sort of buffer before reaching the current Ukrainian defense lines. And it also, of course, gives them the height advantage. And so that's just the rationale behind the Russian advances through this X region over here. And of course, they could also utilize the paved road to directly assault the Ukrainian defenses from the southern direction. And then we look at Novoselivka Persha itself. I don't have the geolocation for it, but you did have a Russian FPV strike on a Ukrainian Bradley, which is, if we look at the location, the front line now is only about 2 kilometers away from the village, and it's basically the largest village that the Ukrainians have east of the Vavcha River. The fall of such a village would essentially mean the end of any sort of Ukrainian resistance, because again, it would just be such a large undermining of the Ukrainian defensive efforts that the Russians would have momentum to completely expel the Ukrainians from the nearby villages. And then from there has to be a conversation about whether the Ukrainians can continue defending along the Vavcha River, try to solidify control over these trenches, and try to unify them into cohesive units. And then for the Russians, of course, how to cross over that river, or at the very least, push them towards it. And then we look at Novopokrovsk. This is an area where, according to Deep State today, there were advances. We look at the extent of those gains over here, essentially advances through open fields, but also along some of the local ponds and the tree lines in the region, about a 1 square kilometer advance. And this includes reaching the actual outskirts of the village, where now part of it is a gray zone, and the Ukrainians are trying to withdraw westwards and solidify a more consolidated line of defense, or just defensive node in Novoselivka Persha, in a way that would try to avoid getting flanked. And if you look at the garrison in the region, 25th Airborne Brigade, large part of it. You also have perhaps some elements of Azov that are still operating, but they may have been rotated out to a certain extent and replaced by fresher units. 61st Mechanized Brigade is also supposed to be in the region. And we do have a lot of question marks about some of these units that are supposed to be around here, because in March they were defending during the Durna River operations, but we haven't heard much about them since that time period. And so that's something that I have to investigate, of course. If we look further north, again, situation is not significantly changed in Sokil. We don't have any new information regarding the Russian entrance into Sokil and the gray zone that is formed due to the ambiguity. And so for now, we're just waiting to see what goes on with new reporting from this region. It is possible the Russians did establish a foothold, but it's not entirely verified. Here we have a video from the 9th, which shows an Abrams tank getting damaged and abandoned east of Sokil. And so I believe this is like the 15th separate piece of essentially footage showing an Abrams tank either getting hit or attempted to get hit, because I can't say with full certainty that they were hit in every single incident, but it's a 15th video published by the Russian side trying to at least hit a unique Abrams, or actually succeeding in doing so. And so again, we're seeing the Abrams being moved in to try to hold the line in the trenches within Sokil, or just to the north of it. Definitely that means that they're exposed and don't have proper cover in those cases, and so they're more liable to getting hits. Now here's where we have some important gains by the Russian side, and this is in the area just to the south and directly within Novo-Oleksandrivka. And so if we look at the extent of the gains, I'll mark them in red for you guys. You can see that the Russian forces were able to gain a rather large foothold in the village itself, and we don't have the full information about how the Russians were able to do this. And so I'm not going to comment on whether it's true that Ukrainians from territorial defense units actually abandoned their positions, because there's simply not enough proof one way or another. That's something that will be elaborated upon in the coming days. But according to Deep State, at least, the Russian forces were able to establish a foothold within the eastern portion of the village. Some Russian sources talking about a full capture. Petrenko, for instance, a pro-Ukrainian source, says that the first 3 streets of Novo-Oleksandrivka were taken by the Russians. And of course, the southern flank, which is very important, which means that the Russian forces were able to get control over additional tree lines and trenches that are located in the region, and are also a part of the general higher elevated area in this sector. And so that just played a support role as the Russian forces directly pushed through this paved road and stormed certain parts of the village. Now, there's an open question about whether the Ukrainians remain in the western side of Novo-Oleksandrivka, because you do have some defensive works in the region, which could still play as a temporary defensive line, because the big fear is that the Russian forces will use the paved road that essentially bisects Novo-Oleksandrivka to continue with their advance northwards. And if we zoom out, we'll see why that's a problem. If you look at the front line, although this entire area where the Russian vector of attack is ongoing is on rather low elevation, that's not really the point. The point is that the paved road on which the Russians are advancing directly leads to this ring road, which is essentially on the highway that connects to Pokrovsk, and essentially connects Pokrovsk to the inner parts of the Donetsk front. And so it would play a big role in undermining the logistics to even get close to it and to be able to fire it directly. And so there is a big emphasis, or at least should be, by the Ukrainians to try to prevent any sort of major breakthroughs over here. And so that's why you had previously the 100th Mechanized Brigade moved in to support the 115th Brigade, which was moved in, I believe, late March. And then you also had the 111th TDF Brigade moved from Nivelske to help with operations here. And so we're going to have to wait and see how this unfolds. But I think that a big reason why this happened is because the Russian forces have focused much of the past month just trying to get additional control of hills that are overlooking Novo-Oleksandrivka from the east. And I was consistently talking about that. And now we see how that local advantage could be put into use. Now let's give an update on the Kanal district in Chasiv because a lot has unfolded since my last video. And it's important to know that in a lot of the mapping from the Ukrainian side, the western part of the district is just labeled a gray zone. I think for the sake of being more conservative in the changes, I'm just going to keep this as under Ukrainian control until we get evidence of some sort of Russian advance here. But we definitely do have Russian gains that occurred in the eastern portion of this district, and we could see that unfolding starting on June 7th. And we talked about that in the previous video, of course, with the Russian forces getting control over some of the northeastern garages. And so that was a big part of undermining Ukraine's line of defense here and then pushing into the center. Here we have a video from June 8th, which shows the Russians raising flags above an apartment building in the Kanal district, right in the center. Some of these apartment buildings really were important to look to the perimeter of the district and try to defend against Russian assaults and vehicles. And so now the Russians are in control of those same vantage points. Here we have another video, but this one from June 9th, showing a Russian soldier placing 2 flags on the Kanal apartment. I think one of them is from the 98th VDV division, which is the sole unit directly involved in storming, I believe, although there may be support from the 200th Arctic Motor Rifle Brigade. And then here we have video from June 8th. I think I talked about this one, but it shows 4 Russian soldiers actually advancing into the center of the Kanal district. I believe this is around the local industry. It might be a part of a factory, and it's also pretty close to the local hospital in the region. And so this entire part of the Kanal district where we're seeing the epicenter of fighting, it makes sense because a lot of these structures are rather large, and as a result, you also do have hospitals in the region, you have technical college, you have the factories that are, of course, located further north, which some of them are still not under full Russian control. Then you have these residential apartments that the Russians got control over. And so, yeah, there is certainly a change here. Russian forces being able to storm these regions despite very fierce Ukrainian resistance in the houses that they do still retain control over. In terms of looking further south, the Russian forces either on the 8th or the 9th were able to get full control over this apartment complex, which is the largest one in the district. Previously, in late May, they were able to establish a foothold within the southern garages, and the Ukrainians, although they kept them at bay, they were never able to fully expel them, and that's why they were able to take advantage of the chaos that was occurring starting around June 7th around the northeastern garages to then push from the southern direction, and of course, with any other columns or any other artillery support coming in from the east, and then just completely control the apartment district. And that, by extension, meant that all these residential areas also fell to the Russian side. And now, in terms of what may still be under Ukrainian control, this can't be verified, but there perhaps could still be Ukrainian defenders located within this other apartment complex. And so the line is pretty vertical right now, but the Russians do have momentum, and there is a question about the northeastern parts where the Russian forces are still trying to push and clear out the remaining parts of the concrete factory and the garages in the region, and that could also potentially compromise any sort of Ukrainian defense that's within the last apartment complex east of the Donbass Canal. Now, capturing the Kanal district is very significant because, first of all, you have a physical crossing along this bridge to reach Chasiv Yar, but that on its own will not be enough to actually sustain a bridgehead and then to, of course, get a substantial amount of control over the city. Just because when you look at the layout of the city, it's not a very compact settlement. It's very spread out. It's on high elevation, very rugged terrain in certain areas, and so you can't just take it over by pushing through one particular point. And especially if you're trying to do that, that would yield very heavy casualties. But definitely getting control over the Kanal district, it undermines the forward-most Ukrainian defense node in the region, and it gives the Russians parity on elevation, because when you compare the elevations in Kanal and Chasiv Yar itself, they are rather similar, and so it sort of neuters the Ukrainian advantage by having control over the Donbass Canal Ridge and control of the areas west of it. And then, of course, it gives the Russians momentum to further clear out the areas east of the Donbass Canal, which include these forested regions south of the Kanal district. And also, when we look at Ivanivske, Deep State today admitted that the Russians have control over these forested regions just south of Ivanivske. So that's just a minor tidbit. looking further north, getting control over the Kanal district, gives the Russians a perfect flanking opportunity to attack Kalina if it does not fall by the time that the Kanal district falls, because you also do have the Ukrainians sending in reinforcements to maintain a line in Kalina, because they know that the capture of the village would give the Russians, again, a physical crossing to reach the northern outskirts of Chasiv Yar. They want to prevent that, of course, at all costs. And so now there's clashes between the Ukrainians, who sent in Bradleys to defend this region, and 200th Arctic Motor Rifle Brigade, and they're shelling very heavily Kalina. Kalina itself is on lower, I actually don't think that it's on necessarily lower elevation, but at the very least, the Russian forces will be on parity when we talk about elevation if they get control over the Kanal district. And so all in all, it gives the Russians a rather significant forward node, which includes, of course, all those apartments, which may actually be overlooking in certain cases the residential areas over here when you look at the comparison between some of these 5-story, 7-story apartment buildings and the residential areas. And so that could also play a role in assisting the Russians later on. And here, let me reference this tweet that I wrote yesterday, just going over some of the Ukrainian units that are moved from Chasiv Yar to the Kharkiv border last month to deal with the Russian offensive activities over there. And I think that could be a part of the explanation for why the Russians were able to continue their momentum and are now in control of much of the Kanal district and are advancing all throughout the Chasiv Yar front. We look at it, 42nd Mechanized Brigade was moved and rotated elsewhere. You look over here, 92nd Assault Brigade was located further south around Klishivka, but again, still was a very crucial part of the general defense in the sector. And the same thing could be said about at least one battalion of the 93rd Mechanized Brigade. Now, some of its battalions have been moved elsewhere, away from Chasiv to the Zherbets River, for instance, or to Vovchansk. We look further south, the Lyut National Police Brigade. This is a very important unit that was involved in capturing Klishivka and then defending it, and now it's been moved to the Vovchansk area. I talked about this in a video a long time ago, but you had the 67th Mechanized Brigade, one of the key units defending the Kanal district or the areas east of it in April. The core of the unit consisted of volunteers from the essentially the military wing of the right sector, and so the Ukrainian leadership under Syrskyi, they actually disbanded the control that this DUK right sector faction had over the brigade and basically split it up into other units. And so now the core of the brigade has been destroyed and it's being replaced. It's in the process of getting new leadership and new recruits and all that. And so that also played a role in just further undermining the Ukrainian defensive capacity in the region. And then I just, of course, gave the Ukrainians the credit that they did try to remedy the manpower issues to a certain extent. They moved in elements of the Kraken Regiment, which was operating in Kharkiv, both around, Kupiansk, but also around Vovchansk, and then also the 2nd Donbass Special Purpose Battalion, which is just a particular battalion of a National Guard unit that was operating in Luhansk. Additionally, we have a video south of Rozdolivka. This was recorded by the Incognito drone unit of the 54th Mechanized Brigade, which is one of two main units that's defending in the Seversk salient. And so they here essentially just dropped grenades onto Russian infantry and tanks in the area south of the village. And it's just enough confirmation to show that the Russian forces were able to advance a total of, 1.6, 1.7 kilometers northwards. And so now they're just on the outskirts of the village. The issue now for the Ukrainians is that all of the hills to the south of the village are now under full Russian control. And they do have a good line of sight into Rozdolivka, which is, of course, adjacent to the Bakhmutovka River. And so the Russians do, of course, have the opportunity to put pressure, both physically by attacking from the flanks and trying to squeeze the Ukrainians out, but also just based on fire supports. But in terms of specifically looking northwards, the Ukrainians do have this makeshift line of defense. And I don't know the extent of how well connected it is at this point in time, but it is located on a hill which overlooks even the Russian positions located on the front line. It also, of course, overlooks Rozdolivka. And so in order to get a full control over Rozdolivka and maintain that, then it will be very important for the Russians to essentially undermine this defense line over here that the Ukrainians have been trying to set up, which is supposed to run horizontally and starts at this certain bulge that the Russians created north of Vesele, and then also connects to the Bakhmutovka River area, including Fedorivka and Perizhne. And so that's just something to keep in mind for future Russian activities here. And lastly, we won't focus on this too much, but there was a Telegram post released in the early hours of June 10th by Kadyrov, where he said that elements of his Akhma regiment were involved in operations within the village of Rizhivka, which is a Ukrainian village in Sumy Oblast on the border between, of course, Sumy, as I said, and the Kursk Oblast, which is on the Russian side. And so he published also a video to go along with it, which showed the Russian operations. He said that, of course, there was also support from other Russian units that are not part of the Akhmat forces. And so what he showed here is just a compilation of mortar fire, artillery fire at Ukrainian houses and fields and various ammo warehouses, defense nodes in the area around the village. And then also the entrance of Russian soldiers along this road over here into the village. And then from there, reaching the village council building. And then, of course, taking photos there. They got the photo op and the geolocation to verify that on June 10th, which just give us confirmation that the Russian forces were at the very least present over here. It does not tell us what happened to the Ukrainians, though. There may still be some Ukrainians in the southern sections of Rizhivka. That's still unknown. There's also a question about whether some of them withdrew to the forested regions near the same river or withdrew further south to the forested regions over here or over here. That is still an unknown. It's just something that you have to keep in mind because this area is just really forested and has not really been affected by artillery as much. And so there's very dense foliage for the Ukrainian side to take concealment in the case of a withdrawal. And that's essentially what Kadyrov is claiming, that after 3 days of battle here, that's what he said, that his DRG forces were able to kick out the Ukrainians and establish full control over Rizhivka. For now, I can't verify that. And also can't verify that the battles here have only been going on for 3 days. But that's, of course, what he's claiming. Something that may be true, and I'm just throwing it out there, is that perhaps there was always a Russian presence in some of these border villages, in these villages around Sumy Oblast, for instance, because we know that there have been DRG operations going on across the border since the beginning of the year that have increased in their scale. And perhaps it was just never mentioned until Kadyrov posted this video, which showed the Russian forces operating here. Because all in all, you don't have any sort of massive Ukrainian defense node that's right on ground zero of the border. And so theoretically, you could have DRGs that are crossing over on a regular basis and just conducting, these rather small operations that are not permanent. And that could also be the case with Rizhivka. We don't know for sure, though, so we have to wait and see. Something that I would say is that the scale of the Russian grouping in the Sumy area or the Kursk area only amounts to around 10,000 men from the latest reporting we have. And if we're looking, for instance, at the Akhmat regiment, that's only several thousand men. And so definitely when we're looking at the chances of a massive offensive, we have to keep in mind the unit structure in the region. And so far, there isn't any sort of massive unit composition or addition that has occurred over the past month that would give us the idea that a massive attack could occur over here. But definitely, as we saw with the operations around Vovchansk and Lipsy, there's always the possibility for the Russians to try to open up a smaller theater with the hopes of diverting Ukrainian attention away from various other parts of the front line. That's something that could always happen, but then would be less so concerned with territorial gains and more so concerned with just tying up Ukrainian forces. If we look at the area that's been attacked, Rizhivka, then it's pretty important because it is only, if we look at it, 6-7 kilometers away from the P44 highway, which is an important highway, which, as you can see, when you zoom out, it connects Sumy, and then as you go to the northwest, various other Ukrainian towns, villages that are near the front line, about 20 to 30 kilometers away from the front line, and then connect to various Ukrainian defense nodes that are involved in defending on the border. It's also, when you measure it, about 12 kilometers away from Bielopolya, which is one of the larger Ukrainian command and control centers in the region. And then when you look at Rizhivka, this was an organizing point for the RDK when they were involved in the Belgorod raids, or actually we have the unit over here. It's actually the Freedom of Russia Legion that was involved in assaulting Tadkino. And they used Rizhivka as their operating base. And then they used Bielopolya, for instance, as a command and control center. And so when we talk about the Russians trying to prevent any sort of further incursions, a part of that could definitely be to just expel them from the nearby border villages. So keep all of that in mind going forward. And yeah, that's really all I have for today. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.